we come to it, what it's really like to run for your life. But this story is not mine, mostly. After all, conveying the experience of tens of thousands fleeing the Paradise Ridge is too much for this video. So we're going to follow the story of this man, Bob Irvine.
I am the executive director for California Vocations. We're a nonprofit to support adults with developmental disabilities. I would say we do a good job in ensuring our clients get an inclusive lifestyle to where they're out in the community and not sheltered in the homes.
Bob's clients are part of the access and functional needs population. In a way, they are the hardest case when it comes to reacting to a disaster. If preparations can work for them, they can work for almost anyone.
Access and functional needs. Now it includes anyone who is disabled, whether that be physically or cognitively disabled, if they're elders, if they're pregnant, if they're non-English speaking, if they have transportation issues, which, as you know, in our county, we have a lot of rural, remote areas. The Ridge area had a very high percentage of access and functional need. 25% of the population just in Paradise alone was over the age of 65.
People like Bob's clients with challenges to health and understanding are often the first to suffer in a disaster. That's why Bob's team at California Vocations has prepared for the worst, along with the disaster planners of Paradise and Butte County. It was these plans that saw Bob, his employees, and clients, over 250 in all, through one of the most destructive fires in American history.
Well, we're required as a licensed facility to do disaster drills every 6 months and fire drills every month. So we were doing the drills where we would load up the car. We didn't necessarily go to an off-site location, but we did the drill in the middle of the night even, where we would evacuate the home into the vehicles. So at least our clients could get a routine down, so they weren't so alarmed and panic if it were ever to happen.
We talk about the worst case scenario, but what we should call it is the worst case imaginable. True worst cases are often much worse than anything in our preparations. An unsinkable ship hits an iceberg in a way no ship has hit any iceberg before. Teams of terrorists hijack 4 planes, all at the same time. A decades-old flaw in concrete shreds open a spillway and threatens 100,000 people. What binds these disasters is that they were all possible, but challenging even for the best planners to anticipate. For my community, the worst case possible came at 6:25 in the morning in a place 10.2 miles from my front door.
Typical morning, my wife was out walking the dog. She works in Chico, so she left first. At the time I saw the smoke plume, I said, "Here we go again." Reminded me of the previous time we were evacuated. So I basically, this time, I thought it was smart, and I packed my own bag and then went to the office.
As Bob went to his office, Cal Fire Chief John Messina went to his office, of sorts. He had just arrived in Polga, and it was his job to stop the campfire.
And we were kind of going through our normal process, and it became evident real quick that being normal that day wasn't going to work. The fire was escalating, and we were having impacts to, civilian population immediately. Every decision we made, even though we thought we were hours ahead of it, we were minutes behind it.
At this point, many in town and in disaster response still thought it was a normal grass fire. In Southern Paradise, I left my home to take my youngest to high school in Chico. About when I did, Bob was arriving at work.
Got to Cypress Lane. Clients were already starting to arrive for the day program. Kind of anxious, nervous. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? The staff were calling them down. I went down. We had 2 residential facilities on that property. So I went down to one of them to make sure things were going okay, see if I could help in any way. Things were actually very orderly. I was very impressed with our staff. They were busy packing up medical records for the clients, things of that nature that we might use.
By now, the smoke plume was so large, everyone in the county could see it. Among the first to learn the true danger was Sherry McCracken, the Chief Administrative Officer of Butte County. She was on the phone with Darren Reed, the head of CAL FIRE in Butte County. It's Sherry's job to manage the county's Emergency Operations Center when it opens.
So Chief Reed said, "We have a fire." I said, "Yeah, I saw that. It's like 15 acres. Just in the minute or something we had talked, it had already grown. And I would say by the time we stopped talking, it was 1,500 acres. And he said, "This is going to be bad." And I said, "I got to get to the office." I have to say, when we got in the Emergency Operations Center, we had no internet, no email, no landlines, and spotty cell phone and text. So we were all operating off of cell phones.
We need to talk about plans. By their nature, disasters are the worst chaos can give us. So applying rigid, pre-made plans is like resisting the incoming tide. New York had to evacuate its EOC in response to the September 11th attacks. Butte County had to evacuate its EOC in response to the 2017 Oroville Dam crisis. Paradise had to evacuate its EOC almost before it opened the morning of the campfire. But all that planning does leave behind something essential.
Every single disaster has its own reality. You know, no disaster is the same.
Semper Gumby, we like to say. You have to be flexible. You have to have plan A, B, and C, and know in the back of your mind, okay, I know this is the plan, but sometimes that plan doesn't work out, and we've got backups and backups.
The preparations give you confidence to know what you're supposed to do.
Even when you don't use them, plans give you focus on what's essential. Focus gives you the ability to improvise elements of your plan to survive the disaster you face. This dynamic was at play for disaster responders from the first hour of the campfire.
Our focus that day, as public safety officials, our focus is life safety, number one. Firefighters and civilians, number one, and public safety officials. Number two is protecting personal property, homes, vehicles. Number three is the wildland. And that day, so many people were impacted so early. Very little firefighting went on early on in the fire because all the resources were dedicated just to securing people and getting them out of their neighborhoods or homes or community.
Typically your average wildland fire, from everything that I've heard and been involved with, spreads somewhere between about 1.4 to 1.9 miles per hour. You know, the campfire was unfortunately the perfect storm.
Developed rapidly due to a combination of topography and wind, and then once it got to the top of the ridge where the dominant winds were really strong, it was purely driven by wind, and it became a blizzard of embers that caused new fires out in front of the main body of the fire. Those fires then developed rapidly, and it went from a fire started in a remote area of Polga to a community of Concow in an hour, to a community of Paradise, which was an additional 3.2 miles in another half an hour. So in an hour and a half time, 7.5 miles.
Now, spot fires aren't uncommon in a wind-driven fire. You still have your control objectives. You go to that spot fire and you put it out, and then you're back fighting the main fire. That's kind of common practice. But in this case, every spot fire that it was established became uncontrollable immediately. Probably around 7:55, we realized nothing normal is going on right now. Typically our firefighters give us our intelligence on fire spread. The only reports of fire spread we were getting were from 911 calls coming in.
The staff came in and said there's spot fires out there, so they immediately started going out and putting out fires that were in our yard. And that created a little bit sense of urgency on people's minds that it might not be the usual evacuation that we did before.
So people did not have a chance. I mean, they had to flee immediately.
And you never want to evacuate a town with a population density of Paradise coupled with Magalia's population density all at once. That's not the desired outcome. However, Mother Nature dictates to firefighters and to law enforcement when we have to make a decision as to what zones need to be evacuated. And Mother Nature's hand played out rapidly that day.
Everywhere, first responders, civilians, and disaster planners were adapting. Evacuation orders went out to every zone in Paradise, Concow, and Magalia. Soon, 52,000 people were fleeing the ridge. But the fire was moving so fast, the plan to use contraflow, one-way traffic out of town had not yet been executed. Where the Skyway entered Paradise, Sheriff Honey was working to change that.
There is a desire in those situations to get a bunch of resources in place before you ultimately initiate contraflow. You want to have signage in place, you want to have people at intersections capable of controlling the intersections that are going to be impacted by the contraflow, and ideally have a law enforcement vehicle initiate the contraflow and lead the caravan, if you will, down the road, because they're going to be going the wrong way. That takes time, and we were overwhelmed. I went to the area on the Skyway that it splits into two, and I stopped there and basically made the decision that we didn't have time to wait. We needed to get people going down the Skyway in both directions. The other side was already impacted, bumper to bumper. I mean, right, it was full of cars, right? And so at that point, and I recognized that there was a risk that if cars were coming up the Skyway in the normal flow of traffic, if I sent other cars down there, that could create a problem. But I just didn't feel at that point we had time to wait for everything. So I radioed my dispatch center and I told them to contact Chico PD and tell the unit who was at the base of the Skyway at Bruce Road that we were going to be sending traffic the wrong way down Skyway to make sure that they didn't send anybody up. Then came the task of actually getting that done, operationalizing that. And so there was a guy standing west of me. He was down the side of the road, his truck was parked, he just was looking towards the fire. And I didn't have any other resources at that time, so I yelled for that guy to come over. I said, listen, I need you to help me get these cars directed down the road, and I need to get more resources here, so while I'm doing that, I'm gonna have you help me with that. And he said, okay. Went then to the row of cars that was proceeding down the Skyway the right way and started directing them over to me. And the first car, I basically explained to them that I was sending them down the Skyway and that they were the first car to be going, and that I didn't know if there was any traffic coming up, and that they were going to essentially lead the pack, but they needed to be careful about what they might encounter as they came.
At my home in Lower Paradise, I received 2 automated evacuation calls in quick succession. One was an evacuation warning for my zone, 11, and the next was an evacuation order for every zone in Paradise. I didn't know it at the time, but I was one of the lucky few to receive these calls. Because of the messages disaster planners had spread since the 2008 fires, we were ready. While I can't prove it, I think I was the last person to leave town without having to drive through fire. Bob was not so lucky.
Probably around 9 o'clock is when you started hearing the explosions. So everybody assumed that they were propane. So folks got in, a house across the street was fully engulfed in flames. It was obvious that the fire was upon us and we had to leave. I was actually the last one to leave 1620 Cypress. I went through all the buildings to make sure nobody was there.
Now we come to the part where there's more story than we can tell.
I had heard reports of people, trying to get their kids from the Ponderosa Elementary School, people trapped in traffic. I had heard about firefighting and rescue efforts going on at Feather River Hospital, where firefighters were trying to keep the fire knocked down around the hospital while hospital personnel, doctors, nurses, and paramedics were assisting trying to get patients loaded and out of the hospital.
In the years to come, you will hear these stories, and hundreds more. But what's essential to take away is another lesson. Stay calm.
It was all about ensuring people were getting in their vehicles, getting on the roadways, were following one another out of town. And what was remarkable to me is while it was bumper to bumper, most people, by far, most people maintained composure. They stayed in line with the vehicle in front of them. As the vehicle in front moved up, they moved up.
I asked CAL FIRE which way I should turn once I get up to Clark Road. And he said, go towards Skyway and then come evacuate down the Skyway. So that's when it was just a parking lot. But everybody was being very patient. The only scary part was when you weren't moving.
I saw very few people panic. I saw very few people get really outwardly agitated. We had fire that was mostly burning surface fuels, but occasionally would crown what we refer to as fire moving into the canopy of the crown of the tree, and would burn maybe one tree or 10 trees or a group of trees, and that was occurring here and there around the area. And fortunately, none were impinged immediately. Some were close, but most cars stayed in line and they just moved out of town.
We kind of made our way over to Skyway. And then once we were on Skyway, it was really moving. They had opened up both lanes, but the fires were really intense on both sides.
Even when the disaster is unfolding around you, even when things seem slow, and even when things look bad, your composure will be the thing that helps you survive. Chief Messina had a term for this.
Sometimes, slow is smooth and smooth is fast.
The idea is being slow means continual, constant movement. Fast in chaotic situations means accidents, which stops everything.
But when people act out like that and freak out, for lack of a better term, it brings chaos and just go across country. It precipitates the fear. And actually, I only saw one individual do that. He did go around off the road and did go around and ultimately ended up 5 cars ahead of where he was before.
And we go by a model of, you risk a lot to save a lot. And so we were trying to explain to him, today's the day we risk a lot.